Oceanside Orchids out of Oceanside, California. But probably you guys would also recognize him. He grows the paths, and he managed a couple other things for Sunset Valley Orchids in their greenhouse. So all of his plants are grown along with them throughout there. He's been a judge for over 20 years. I didn't realize you could put in your bio that you were one of the youngest judges at one point in the American Orchid Society.
I was the youngest judge for like 10 years. It's awful.
How old were you when you started?
19.
Wow. Oh, wow. And a student.
Really. Yeah. So he has a lot of experience in growing orchids. Today we brought him in to talk about paths and specifically important trends in complex path hybridization. So without further ado,
Thank you very much. I have to admit, I was really excited to work at dinner because there was a lot of talk about the history of things, and the history of the society, and the history of orchid growing in the Midwest. We're standing here in a building attached to a place that's immensely historical. The idea of orchids being historical, like I don't know if you guys know this, but it's incredibly unique among plants. Orchids are the only group of plants that have Grex names. Grex is like a set of siblings. When you make a cross between two species or two hybrids, the resulting name is a Grex. That does not exist in any other kind of plant. So when you go out and you buy a rhododendron, or you go out and you buy a new daffodil, the name of that daffodil is what we call a clonal name, a name for an individual plant. And no one really knows who the mom and dad of that daffodil or that rose or that camellia or that rhododendron are. Maybe somebody has an idea what the mother plant was because they collected seed from it or whatever. The fact that we have that information written down is magic, because it allows us to backtrack through all of the complexities and all of the wondrous history of orchids. That's my favorite part of orchids. Like if I was to name one thing that's the very best part, yes, blooming the first bloom seedling out of the cross that you made and getting excited with how it looks is right up there. But the history of orchids is just absolutely fascinating. And that's largely what I'm going to share with you today, specifically about paths. Can we get the lights?
Yeah.
Paths, particularly complex paths, have an unbelievable history. A lot of it was written here at Mobile. From there, it's all over the place, and so the sort of center of path breeding now is really in Japan. And so this is a picture of some plants in Japan. But really, for years, it was in California at the Orchid Center. So this is complex season. This is January of 2007 at Oz. And you can walk through there and you can pick any plant out of there. And Terry would handwrite the price on the back of the label, and it was a jaw-droppingly disgusting thing. But the fact that you could read what was on the label and then go to the Sanders list or go to, I guess, the website now and like research the history of all the parents of all the people who were involved in making all those plants, that to me is what really makes orchid growing fascinating. So what we're going to do today is we're going to look a little bit at sort of the history, especially of complex paths, sort of how complex paths have been bred from the late 1800s until now, by looking at some pathways, some distinctive lines that have resulted in plants like the pictures that I just showed you. The early ones of these plants, the building blocks of making complexes are often no longer extant in collections. They're gone. And that's really a shame, and something that like we talk a lot about remaking some of these crosses. It's very interesting to look at what some of these old plants look like. The first path crosses Harrisoniana, which was registered in 1869, the cross of Barbatum and Villosum. From that Grex, 5 seedlings resulted. Remember that in 1869, there's no such thing as flasks. There's no such thing as aseptic culture. There's no knowledge of bacteria. There's no knowledge of any of that stuff. And so the guy that made this cross took a capsule, a mature capsule, and sprinkled it on the parent plant, and 5 little seedlings popped up. I was at Mobot today, saw a plant of Ludiola from the original grass. I also saw a plant of nigrum, which I thought was gone, but it's here. And then Mobot doesn't have the most important one, the FCC. But that's around all over the place. It grows like a weed. So fascinating. So these are Royal Horticultural Society paintings. The Royal Horticultural Society in England paints pictures of awarded plants. So rather than like have a photograph, they've carried on this tradition of painting awarded paths since 1835, when the first path was awarded. And so when we see these pictures, these paintings, that's where those are from. The history of sort of who made these plants is just as fascinating as the plants themselves. So this is a guy named Henry Graves. He interestingly was a guy that was in New York. The fact that he's involved in some of these things is really incredible. This is a herbarium sheet of Herrerianum plants, of flowers of Herrerianum plants that were sent to Harvard from growers all over the world. If we look up here on the wall, you can see some herbarium, like modern herbarium sheets. What's interesting about these is that each of these individual Herrerianum flowers has like a little number attached to it. And if you look down here on the herbarium sheet, there's all kinds of like where they all came from. And one of those people where it came from is this guy, Henry Graves, this guy right here. Henry Graves, interestingly, had one of these plants in New York, in the United States. So despite the fact that this plant was made in England, we already had these wonderful plants here. This is the guy who made the original cross. It's a guy named John Dominy. John Dominy made the first ever orchid hybrid. He also made the first ever path hybrid. The first orchid hybrid was a Calanthe, interestingly. This is not something that he undertook without risk. At this time, the idea of making hybrids was seen as an act against God by the English church. And so there was some confusion about whether or not this was something, making an orchid hybrid was something that was going to be punishable by jail time. He did it anyway. And here we are now, 250,000 hybrids have passed later. The most important of these early plants is this, Leanum. Leanum is a cross between the species Insigne and Spicerianum, was originally registered in 1888. If we look at some of these plants, right, like these plants, this plant is still alive. I have this plant. It was awarded in 1903. That makes the plant, 120 some years old. It's amazing. These plants are no longer extant. Today, I found a brand new Leanum that I thought was completely gone, called Prospero, that was awarded about the same time here in the collection of Mobot, after searching for Leanums for 25 years. It's incredible. Here are herbarium sheets of Leanum, so it's really interesting to read a little bit about all the different people in these herbarium sheets and the fact that all these plants were sent from all over the world to Oaks Ames at Harvard, who made these composite herbarium sheets of all the different plants in the collection here. And this cross was made by a guy named Sir Trevor Lawrence, who is this guy in early age and later, who was quite an interesting person in England. He, maybe more than anything else, helped the Royal Horticultural Society grow. He was the president of the RHS for 35 years. And he grew the membership of the Royal Horticultural Society from about 1,000 to 10,000. He presided at the first conference on orchid hybridization in 1899, again, under the same kind of weird church conditions about making hybrids. He's perhaps best known for buying a really special plant, Aerides Lawrenceae, which he bought for 235 pounds, the equivalent of $30,000 today, in 1899. He named the plant after his wife, which I guess is the right thing to do. If we look at these herbarium sheets, right? So if we look real carefully at the names on the herbarium sheets, the number one here of these Leanums, so all these ones here, are seedlings of the Corning collection, no names, sent to Mr. Ames by the proprietor of American Garden arrived, blah, 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 blah. So who is Corning? That's this guy. You might know him from Corningware. This is the guy, his name is Erastus Corning. He's one of the first sort of rags to riches guys in New York. He started life as a hardware clerk and then invested in banks and railroads and then invested in a brand new process of producing steel called the Bessemer process, which is the way that we make steel now. He sort of cornered the market in Albany for this process, and in doing so, cornered the market for all steel and iron goods produced in the state of New York. He was eventually elected mayor of Albany, and then was elected to Congress, and then was eventually the wealthiest man in the state of New York. He was so wealthy that he tried to have like political aspirations. So there's a really interesting letter from him to Lincoln during the Civil War, advising about prison conditions in Union prisons and how Union prison conditions were so poor, and in order to save face, we would have to improve the conditions of Union prisons, which is pretty amazing considering how bad Union prisons were. It's really interesting to read some of the letters and the things that these people wrote. Really interesting to read like this guy's name and orchid grower's name in the letters of Abraham Lincoln. From this time period, there's a number of other very important early hybrids. Some of these hybrids, like nitens, the cross between Insignia and villosum, none of these plants are alive anymore. So all of these early RHS awards to nitens are all gone. We can appreciate what nitens looks like now. It's quite beautiful. And this is a picture that sort of gives some indication of just how vigorous these early plants were, and the fact that it's that vigor that really drives the production of all these other paths. It's that interest, that ability to grow these plants, which is why they're so special. These are much faster growing, much easier to grow than either species, Insignia or villosum, both of which are actually pretty easy to grow in the first place. Nitens is a veritable weed, and that's why people use it. Liatum, which we saw previously, back across to Insignia, makes a grax called Actaeus. Actaeus is incredibly important in the history of complex paths of all kinds, both in the production of greens and whites. This plant, Bianca, specifically, is very important. You can see that it doesn't have very much color, and just a few little spots in the center of the flower, and that has bred forward to make what we consider to be like a modern green path. Interestingly, it's also bred forward to create what we call a modern white path. This plant was in my collection until I donated it to the Phipps Conservatory in Pittsburgh. We still have it. Pretty exciting. Lianum is, Actaeus brings us to this guy, Frederick Sander. Frederick Sander is perhaps the most well-known person in orchids. This is him with his Victoria Medal of Honor award for distinguished service in horticulture. Frederick Sander bred everything under the sun. And it's really kind of amazing to think about his contributions to orchids for no other reason than because he and then his son kept records of all orchid grexes up until like 1960 when the Royal Horticultural Society took it over. If he and his son hadn't done that, we wouldn't know anything about grexes. We wouldn't have had registered grexes. We wouldn't be able to research the history the way that we can now. It's all thanks to this guy. He bred rhododendrons, streptocarpus, African violets, all kinds of different plants in greenhouses that looked like this in England and then eventually in Belgium. It's interesting to think about the life of an orchid grower during that time. You would get up at 5:30 in the morning and go and water your greenhouses, work a 15-hour day, work 7 days a week, have no time off ever.
That's rough.
Kind of amazing to think about the fact that those were people that produced the plants that we've come to love. Similar time frame, we had the first Maudie paths, although this is mostly a talk about complexes. Thinking about the history of some of the other kind of paths is wonderful to think about as well. Maud is the name of the head grower of Charlesworth and Company, who registered this cross in 1901. The guy's name is James Beckwooley. And he bred this first Grex of Maudie, which is very interesting, sort of unique in the orchid world, from two albino parents, from the albino versions of Colossum and Lawrenceanum. The colored version of Maudie wasn't registered until about 15 years later. This plant, Magnificum, with its RHS picture and a modern example of it, is still in collections now. It's incredibly easy to grow. It's really an unbelievable thing to think about all the different people who have held that plant, all the different people who have used it, bred with it, grown it, used it as cut flowers. Charlesworth and Company eventually were the ones that pioneered the growing of seedlings in sterile conditions. So again, think about the fact that this plant was bred by sprinkling seed from its capsule around the base of the plant. The first iteration of making Pathmondi resulted in 2 seedlings. Both seedlings are still alive today. One is this one, Magnificum. The other is a different one called Bankhouse, which looks very similar. Mondi was remade a bunch of times. This is probably the best of the albino varieties. This is the Queen, which won an AM in 1952 from the Royal Horticultural Society, and then an AM from the AOS in 1981. This plant is still very common in modern collections. There's Maudis of all different colors, and the creation of these Maudis eventually has resulted in all the plants that we can go to the grocery store and buy now. That's not a very good picture. It was taken at the very beginning of good digital cameras. You get the idea. This plant is likewise incredibly important. This plant is was the first chance tetraploid path, Christopher Grand Duke Nicholas, which unfortunately is no longer in existence. Christopher Grand Duke Nicholas really revolutionized path breeding. A tetraploid plant has twice the number of chromosomes that a normal plant has. So a normal plant and you and your dog all have 2 sets of chromosomes, one from each parent. It turns out that in orchids and in many other kinds of plants, if you have twice those numbers, 2 sets inherited from each parent, that the resulting flower is bigger and flatter and rounder. And this plant, Christopher Grand Duke Nicholas, is the first of these early complex paths to have what looks to be like a modern path shape. So Frederick Sander bred Actaeus and used a lianum. This is Frederick Sander. A couple more pictures of him. Pictures of his greenhouses, a whole greenhouse of nothing but Phalaenopsis schilleriana, a whole greenhouse of nothing but Cattleya trina. It's amazing. Christopher Grand Duke Nicholas went on to make all kinds of interesting things itself, including the Grex Chardmore, of which Miss Calburn here is still around, despite being registered in 1923 and awarded in 1927. Chardmore is the name of the garden of Thomas Calburn. And he's a pretty interesting and important guy. It turns out that his collection went on to a guy named Thomas Moore, and Moore went on to fund, this again is a very bad picture of his collection of insignes, which was like 250 individual plants. This is the George Moore Medal given by the Royal Horticultural Society for the best path in each year. So you can see there in 1926, they're still giving this out now, and a lot of the plants that we're looking at here are all Moore Medal winners.
Who is that George Moore? Because there was a director of the garden here that was George Moore back in that era.
Right, so this George Moore is an English guy.
Okay.
And in England, he was considered at the time to have the best path collection, and particularly excelled in these different varieties of insignia. A lot of these early growers published what's the word for it? Books of their own plants. And so Moore has a book of his own plants where these 250 different varieties of insignia are all listed, and none of them have any descriptions. It's so frustrating. Christopher Grand Duke Nicholas went on to produce some really special things. You can see here that these are plants that are starting to approach the shape of a normal complex path, a modern complex path, despite being bred in 1931 and 1925. Breeding loan from Glenannon up to produce Grace Darling. We're finally getting back to plants that exist in the world. So this is Grace Darling AMRHS. Grace Darling Forfordshire existed in Japan as late as 1995. I haven't found one since. When we look at this kind of breeding, what really stands out is the idea of backcrossing things. Over and over and over again, these mixes of just these few species to produce what is considered a modern complex path. By backcrossing, by taking a hybrid and crossing it back to one of its parents, over and over and over again, we've arrived just by selective pressure, by looking carefully at the offspring and saying, I want a flower that's bigger and rounder and fuller, more circular, waxier, that lasts longer. We've been able to get to a modern complex path with essentially 4 contributions from species. To go in a different direction, we can look at whites. And white complex paths are a good example of not that, the opposite of that, of creating something essentially from nothing. And that's really the story of this guy, F.C. Puddle, Frederick Charles Puddle, after whom this plant is named. Frederick Charles Puddle has perhaps the most interesting history of any of these different growers. This is Frederick Charles Puddle, and the guy who employed him, Charles McLaren. Frederick Charles Puddle was one of these guys that worked 15 hours at a time in his first greenhouses. He worked at a collection called St. Quentin. When the owner of that, William St. Quentin, died, Puddle applied to work for Charles McLaren, for Lord Aberconway. Lord Aberconway was incredibly interested in creating unbelievably beautiful plants of all kinds. It's very interesting to go to his former estate called Bodenant in England, where he literally picked up a whole village and moved it elsewhere, rerouted a river, brought in mature trees to create an unbelievable setting for his mansion, essentially. But Puddle is interesting because of the trust that Charles McLaren put in him. After St. Quentin passed away, McLaren went out and got all the plants that Puddle had bred for St. Quentin, sometimes at unbelievably exorbitant prices. He got back the 3 major white paths that Puddle had made, which went on to produce things like F.C. Puddle. In fact, he did so much for McLaren that McLaren even changed the names on some of the plants in order to give credit to Puddle where St. Quentin hadn't done so. So as an example, there's a plant called Albion, which is another one of these white hybrids that hasn't really bred on very much, that won an award in 1923, and then McLaren bought the plant and named the whole plant, named it a completely different thing, and then it got re-awarded in 1925. And he did that so that he could give Puddle credit for making the cross and allow Puddle to name the plant. Pretty interesting guy. So Frederick Puddle bred all kinds of other things as well, rhodies and fuchsias and clivias. He won the Victoria Medal for service to horticulture. Interestingly, his grandson still manages the property at Puddle. Here it is. Wow. Pretty spectacular. So the focus of this talk is to think about where these things have gone, to think about where white paths have gone. So in one generation in the United States, they went to this. In 1968, this grass was registered by McClellan's, a company in California, and really here we're looking at white paths that are almost like normal, modern, spectacular quality. So the idea of modern complexes is really interesting. The sort of beginnings of these emerged in the 30s and to 70s. A lot of these plants are still around, so it's great fun to go and try and find them and collect them. From the sort of mix of different species and hybrids that were made before the 1930s, some very particular directions emerged, and then were a little blurred and then re-emerged, and that's where we are now. So the idea of making a plant that looks like this in 1938, what we want to do with this is think how can we improve this? And this, Memoria Arblendia here is a really good example of the first in a direction of making big red spotted complexes. So from there, we can make more spots, like many of these crosses that were made in Japan. Or we can make redder flowers. And the idea of making these heavily spotted plants like this, there's no path in nature that exists like this. But by careful selection, we can breed some pretty special things. Again, if we mix them with whites, we can get things that are sort of intergrades between them. If we mix them with plants that are more red, we can get these beautiful lustrous reds, but the spotted color of Lendia just continues to carry on for years and years and years. Most of it through this plant. So if we compare this to Blendia, we've improved the size, we made the plant flatter. From both an American Orchid Society perspective and a Royal Horticultural Society perspective, what we're looking at, when we're trying to quote unquote improve a flower, is to make it bigger and rounder and flatter. So imagine in your mind a circle, hold the circle over the flower. If it fills the circle well, it's considered good or awardable. And for some reason, it takes AOS judges like 10 years to learn. Sparkshot has gone on to produce some really spectacular things. Again, these big red flowers with spotted dorsals, many of which were made in Japan or made in the United States and then made their way to Japan. Really lovely, lovely, big, flat, special colored flowers.
Is there a particular horticulturalist in Japan that is?
We'll talk about that at the end of the presentation. It's been a guy and then his son who have really sort of carried the torch forward with a lot of this kind of breeding. And so these are pictures from the 2024 Tokyo Dome show in Japan, illustrating Sparkshot project. The last of these like really critical parent plants is this Hellas. Hellas is an interesting flower because it's not particularly attractive on its own. What it does, though, is produce an unbelievable amount of seed. Because it produces so much seed, you can cross it with anything and get lots and lots and lots of results from it. And that's incredibly important when you're breeding plants. You have to have things that make seed. If the plants don't make seed, then you don't really get a lot of offspring. And Hellas is really good at that. Interestingly, Hellas seems to breed by basically being totally recessive for color. So anything you put with Hellas ends up being the color of the other parent, and Hellas seems to improve the shape of its progeny and make its progeny much, much easier to grow. Hellas is the story of George Holford, who is another really interesting guy. This is George Holford here when he was young and when he was older. He spent a lot of time fighting the Boer War in South Africa in the early 1900s. When he returned, another one of these guys who developed an unbelievable estate at a place called Westernburg, which I'll show you in just a minute. His grounds are just unbelievably full of these beautiful, beautiful rhododendron plants. Interestingly, his wife passed away in the early 20s and it wrecked him. And so he just devoted all of his time and effort to just growing plants. He had no children. And his collection went eventually to his head grower, who's a man by the name of H.G. Alexander, whose name is sort of synonymous with incredible orchids. These are all pictures of the estate when it was at its peak. Wow. So each one of these guys is responsible for an individual greenhouse. That's her whole job. This is a picture that was taken from an old newspaper, so incredibly grainy. What Holford was really well known for were Laeliocattleya, which at the time were incredibly rare. A cross between two different genera of orchids was something that was really special. And in 1906, he built what many people consider to be the finest display of orchids ever exhibited. Imagine this display is in Chelsea outside of London, and you live like 50 miles north of Chelsea, and there's no cars. So this guy and his growers loaded these plants on horse carts and drove them to Chelsea and put in this exhibit of all white Laeliocattleya. Wow. Unbelievable. Again, I apologize for the quality of this. It's a picture taken from a newspaper. This guy here, this is H.G. Alexander. It's the only picture of him that exists. H.G. Alexander was a really interesting guy. He inherited this unbelievable collection from Holford. He ran the collection for a long time. He had two kids, both of whom died in World War II. So this is a man who lifted himself up, who crossed class boundaries when that didn't happen. There was like none of that in England. You didn't become a wealthy person. That idea, you were either born a wealthy person or you weren't. The fact that Holford donated his collection, his estate to H.G. Alexander was sort of the first step of building like generational wealth, and then both of his kids died. And so what we're left with now are all these plants that are named Westenberg, which are the very finest plants that exist. Elsie Luster Westenberg, the most important lavender cattleya. Cymbidium alexandri Westenberg, the most important cymbidium. Hellas Westenberg, one of the most important paths. Really, really a remarkable plant. Because Hellas is so remarkable, people have selfed it over and over again, or sieved it to other Hellases. We have third and fourth and even fifth generation Hellas plants now, which is kind of remarkable to think about. Hellas produces some unbelievably beautiful plants. These are all direct progeny of Hellas. Like these have Hellas as a parent. And so this big, lacquered, flat, rounded, beautiful, colored flower all trace their heritage back to Hellas Westenberg. During this time frame, there's a few other people breeding past, things like diversion, also sort of in the same vein. This looks like a modern complex path. Diversion is another good story of a guy named Peter Black. And this is Peter Black right here. Peter Black ran a nursery in England, was half of a nursery called Black and Flory. So he worked for a guy named Baron Rothschild, after whom Path Rothschildianum is named, in Vienna, and then moved to England and started his own nursery. He's perhaps best known for Cattleya bobens, which is his hybrid. The war years were incredibly detrimental to Peter Black and to Black and Flory in general, and all the plants from Peter Black went to Rivermont orchids in Tennessee, and then many of those plants came here. It was really interesting to look through the Cattleya collection here at OBOT today and see Rivermont as the colonial name on a lot of plants. That's all from this guy. It's amazing. These are all diversion projects. So the idea of breeding these beautiful, beautiful plants from something that somebody made in the 30s is really remarkable. This plant is the first of these that are bred in the United States. So this uses diversion as a parent in 1955 to breed a sort of ungainly, weird-looking flower called Yerba Buena Whitecaps, which won an AOS award in 1967. We'll come back to that. It's really important later on. During that same time frame, the most important red complex path was bred. This is Winston Churchill in both the spotted and the red brush color forms. Winston Churchill went on to produce unbelievable progeny as well. Several different selfings and sievings of Winston Churchill exist, including some very, very rounded flowers like this one, which is really every bit as good as a modern complex path, but in 1982. Winston Churchill was one of the first major breeder plants to come to the United States. And so in the US, breeders used this to create all kinds of really beautiful red paths in the 70s and 80s, including Carl and Imogene Keys, registering the plant Keys Hill in California. Beautiful. These are all Winston Churchill projects. The color of these is lovely. The idea that you could cross between totally different lines of paths and create these things is really also very interesting. This is the cross of Winston Churchill and Ellis. The cross of Winston Churchill and a species path called a Brachypetalum, which is white. You get that. A cross of Winston Churchill and a dark colored Maudie path, like we looked at earlier in the presentation. These big, round, flat flowers like this excited a lot of growers in California, and so the story of Winston Churchill kind of moves into a place, a very special place for me, called the Orchid Zone that we started this presentation. These are all hybrids that Terry Root at the Orchid Zone made using Winston Churchill. Beautiful. Before we get there, though, we have to have one other major redgrax and one other really major breeder of these plants. The cross of Noble, which is this sort of awkward-looking thing, and Belissaire, of which there's no pictures whatsoever, resulted in a grax called Peony, which was registered in 1956. Peony is perhaps the best solid red breeder out there, and there are lots and lots of really good peonies, many of which are still extant in collections today, including Regency, Debonair, and Mulberry, which are all plants that I have in my collection, and then some that some of my friends have in Australia. Beautiful. Peony went on to breed a Grex called Amanda, which looks very much like an improved peony. And then Amanda went on to produce unbelievably beautiful, rounded, red, complex stems. Some of the best reds come from peony. So this is Orchilla, which many consider to be the best solid red complex path. These come from an organization called Ratcliffe Orchids in England, which did a lot of breeding with peony and a lot of really beautiful red breeding. Many of the Ratcliffe plants were then sent to the United States, ended up in the hands of people like Hadley Cash, who I'm sure many of you are familiar with. Hadley was a masterful breeder of complex paths, passed away too soon about a decade ago now. This is his best red. Combining lines is really an interesting idea. So combining these disparate spotted lines from different spotted red paths to create new things is really this guy's responsibility. This is Terry Root with my AOS judging mentor, Francisco Baptista. Terry was an interesting guy. You either got along with him or you didn't visit the orchids. You can see here all these lovely multiflorals. He bred all kinds of really great paths. Here he is with my son, who just graduated high school 18 years ago. And he bred really lovely plants out of these plants that came originally from England, beginning really with gridlock, aiming to sort of stretch the size of these paths to really unbelievable dimensions. So he took a plant like peony, which is maybe like a 3.5-inch wide flower, and turned it into provocation, which is a 6-inch wide flower, like this. Huge. And he wasn't done. This was made in 1993. He went on to produce more and more of these kinds of hybrids with big, giant flowers and spotted dorsals. Many of them aren't around in the United States anymore because he sold them to Japan for thousands of dollars per plant. This plant won a gold medal at the Japan Grand Prix. So if you win a gold medal at the Japan Grand Prix, you get $10,000. So in some cases, it's a pretty good investment. Why doesn't your show get cash prizes? Continuing on to 7-inch wide flowers, things like Western Thunder, really unbelievably beautiful things. But then Terry's sort of last Grexes at the Orchid Zone out of these unbelievably big plants, big flowers, were very interesting in terms of their color. His best cross right before he sold the Orchid Zone was this one, Memoria Sabrina Mark. This plant, when I saw it, was 8 inches across, almost 20 centimeters. And the number of them that were at this stage was really impressive. And even more impressive was the fact that although that plant looks like it's in a 4-inch pot, it was in a 2-inch pot, put in a 4-inch pot. So first bloom, tiny little plants, unbelievable quality, all big, all flat, all round. There's one in a 2-inch pot. Shocking. And so from those plants, again, the Japanese got a lot of those and ended up taking a lot of them to the Tokyo Dome show, continuing to breed with them in Japan, improving them, making bigger and flatter and rounder flowers. In addition to Japan, some of these flowers went to Germany. So these are all spotted complex paths that come from a nursery called Erpingen Durbusch in northern Germany, where the plants are grown as pot plants. So if you go into the local Home Depot in northern Germany, you don't buy Phalaenopsis, you buy these. It's kind of amazing to think about. This plant has the largest natural spread of anything in the entire presentation at 19.6 centimeters. That's almost 12 inches. Millennium is the name of it, and this particular cultivar, Millennium Diablo, was one of the most sought after plants of the late 2000s. Went all over the place and bred really wonderful things everywhere. As we advance in greens, you think back to some of the greens that we looked at in the beginning of the presentation, things like Grace Darling, that were just the result of intergressively breeding 4 path species. We're now here producing these monstrous, beautiful, beautifully shaped green flowers that went on mostly at the orchid zone to produce more of the same huge, beautifully rounded flowers. One of the things that Terry did that was pretty special was to take some of these big green flowers and cross them with Patherianum, which is a new species to add into this mix. That was not a species that was described at the same time frame as a lot of the early path breeding went on. And early path breeding, by and large, didn't really incorporate Ferrianum, but Terry did. And the results are just different looking enough to be interesting. His best green cross is this Pacific Shamrock, which is a Jolly Green Gem hybrid. Again, the flowers are like 18 centimeters in natural spread, flat as can be. Picture a circle in your mind. Hold the circle to the flower. Pretty good. This is Machan Takahashi. Him and his dad own Tokyo Orchid Nursery in Japan. And really, it's Machan and his dad that have driven a lot of this breeding of Japanese plants, where I keep saying over and over again that the plants end up in Japan, because this guy wants to breed the best complex taps in the world, and he's done it. Machan's a really interesting guy. He went on to make a lot of very interesting hybrids with orchid zone plants. This is Amarillo Star, sort of state of the art in 2013. Big rounded flowers, really lovely color, a minimum of white in the dorsal sepal are all things that he was searching for. And Amarillo Stars are still some of the very best rounded Japanese taps. I was 70,000 because this guy paid Machan 70,000 yen, $7,000 to buy this plant. In 2020, Machan registered the Grex Atlantic Stone. These are all Atlantic stones. Again, I can't really imagine a more rounded flower than that. For a long time, the petal width here in some of the early complex paths was like 3 centimeters or 4 centimeters. At the orchid zone, it was 6 or 6.5 centimeters. Machan bloomed this plant as 8 centimeter long petals. So bigger and bigger and flatter and flatter and rounder and rounder. Those are the names of the game when you're breeding complex paths. There it is, Atlantic Stone. Pretty circular. To me, it's amazing to think that this comes from just a few species. Narrow flowers, not really very like flat or round or anything, and just in 100 years of careful selection, you get to this. And all the stepping stones along the way are so interesting to think about. These are all different Japanese breeding for round green flowers. This is Tsukuba Sweet. This shape is my favorite shape in complex paths. Again, this is a plant that has 8 centimeter wide petals. Bred in 2008, and we haven't really seen a new Grex from this, which is surprising. And these were what Terry left behind when he sold the orchid zone. This was the last generation produced by Terry, but then sold by the people that bought the orchid zone from him, called Pacific Queen. So this was state of the art in 2014. So it's been a while since these pictures. Amarillo Star was registered in 2020. Giant Stone again registered in 2020. Or sorry. That wasn't right. This one. Amarillo Star, or Atlantic Stone was registered in 2020. This was registered in 2014. So where's the next set of plants? The next set of plants are blooming size seedlings right now. One of the worst parts about growing complex paths is it takes between 6 and 10 years to bloom down. So the generation time here is so slow that we're just now starting to see the results of breeding with Pacific Queen, the results of breeding with things like Amarillo Star or with Atlantic Stone. Certainly a beautiful Grex. Now, we talked briefly about FC Puddle, and I told you that we'd come back to things like FC Puddle and like Yerba Buena. And so the last sort of set of things to look at are the development of these beautiful white complex paths, which are the set of plants that we haven't really looked at yet. Even this one has a lot of controversy associated with it. It's a cross between FC Puddle's beautiful white and a little spotted brachypath called Godefroy, which was made originally by a nursery in Seattle called Beals. And Beals produced these plants and selected the best one out of the 3 plants that germinated from the cross and called it Ruth. And then sold divisions of Ruth all over the place, including down into Southern California, where it was awarded and had its name changed to white pepper. So sometimes you still see Ruth associated with this. Really, many of them are called white pepper. Thanks, John Haynes, for changing the name. Terry Root got his hands on a plant of it and crossed it with Green Mystery, which is an offspring from Yerba Buena, to make the first big white complex Grex. Thank you, Francisco, for this picture in 1987 when I was 7 years old. White Knight was phenomenal in terms of the roundness of these whites. We hadn't seen any whites that were these big, round, beautiful flowers like this. And many White Knight plants are still alive because they grow well and bloom well, and they're beautiful even now. Even now, that's a really nice circular flower. When it blooms in my collection, I always look at it and think, how could this have possibly been made in 1987? This plant is interesting because it even won an award from an awarding organization that no longer exists, the Cymbidium Society of America, which we've seen CSA awards a couple times today, but each one of those steps of history is just fascinating. These are progeny from White Knight, with White Knight as a direct parent. So big, round, full, beautiful white flowers. Unfortunately, White Knight was not a great breeding plant, and so that set of whites was sort of the end of the line in 2005 or 2006. They would not breed another generation. And so Terry, being the guy that he was, went back and tried again by crossing a little bracky plant called Gray Eye, a little white plant with little red spots, with an offspring from White Knight called White Castle to make a Grex called Ice Castle that was fertile. So by perseverance and by working with this and continuing to breed this plant, he was able to get fertile whites again. Ice Age, the cross between Pacific Shamrock and Ice Castle, was registered in 2007. Again, a quantum leap forward in terms of size and shape of the whites. And at the same time, Terry was breeding greens. And so Elfstone is a big, big jump from the original Green Mystery plant that made White Knight. Elfstones are big, giant, rounded flowers. Very difficult to grow these, interestingly, so they're mostly gone now. But Elfstone itself, when combined with some of these whites, made really wonderful things. Hadley's last Grex that won an award of quality was named after his son and was awarded just about 3 years before he passed away. So this is an Elfstone cross to make these big, beautiful greens. Beautiful selection of plants. But once again, in Japan is where these greens really stood out. Machan's father made a cross called Emerald Future. Beautiful big flowers. This one won the Japan Grand Prix in 2014, and here is a proud owner of the plant, giving you some evidence of size here with Takahashi-san with this lovely project. These whites and greens went to Japan and have produced some really spectacular things. The first true pink complex paths with Premium Magic here. Some really fine whites with a Grex called Giant Knight, originally produced in 2013. And since 2013, we've had room for just one more Grex. So here's the last Grex to talk about. In the United States, Shirakane. In Japan, a sort of incidental cross called Castle Manoa that everyone was really excited about in terms of production of whites. And then this cross, Galaxy Stone. Registered in 2019, perhaps the roundest, fullest, whitest flower that's ever been seen. Again, this is the result of crossing something really simple, something that just has a few of these early species, and then selecting and selecting and selecting and selecting for this beautiful shape and roundness and fullness. These big, beautiful flowers. I can't wait to see what comes next. The first offspring from this plant should bloom this year. Where are we going to go? What's next? To me, that's why breeding is interesting. That's why history is interesting, because with a perspective of history, you know where you've been, and you can think about where you can go next. Just love that about complexes. So you go to the Tokyo Dome show, and this is what awaits. This is the selection of these plants, all tracing their way back to 4 or 5 important path species 150 years ago. The ability of breeders to take what was made back then and breed it until these rounded, full, beautiful flowers is so unbelievably impressive. It's pretty exciting to see. It's pretty exciting to be a part of. I hope you're excited about complex taps too. Thanks. I'm happy to take questions. If we could get the lights, that would be great. Yes.
So I've never been to a show like this, where someone has spent the entirety of their life, breeding some amazing plant. And I don't mean to be, pejorative, but is there security there that doesn't just have somebody come by
Yes.
and snatch somebody's
Yes.
life work
Yes.
off of the, okay.
There's definitely a security.
Okay. Because some of these plants are not large.
It's really, yeah, yes, there's security.
Okay.
Okay, so a lot of people come, like when I give a path talk, a lot of people say, oh, I'm just not successful with paths. How do I grow paths? So I thought we'd talk a little bit about that, and if you have questions about sort of how to grow them, I'm happy to address those too. I grow paths in bark, in shade, in intermediate temperatures, and really wet. And that's what it really seems like they like. And to me, that's one of the things that really prevents a lot of people from growing paths well, is that they don't grow the plants wet. Fred told me this one time. He said, Cattleyas grow when they're dry, and paps grow when they're wet. It's a really interesting thing to think about. Cattleyas grow stuck to the side of a tree, so they spend most of their life dry. Paps grow in leaf litter and little sticks and moss and stuff on the forest floor and spend most of their lives wet. And so when you grow plants in a mixed collection, you have Cattleyas and Phalaenopsis and Oncidiums along with your paths. It's often really easy to just water everybody on the same schedule, and on that schedule, paths don't get enough water. And that's why when people grow mixed collections, they say, oh, I'm not successful growing paths. So that is the biggest piece of advice I would give you. The easiest way to make sure that you're growing paths well is to water them a lot. So in the wintertime, when it's cold, when the greenhouse heater kicks on at 50 degrees, and it's cloudy, like Southern California winter, I'm out there watering the plants at least once a week. And then in the summer, like this time of year, as it's starting to heat up, twice a week. And then as it really gets into summer, in Southern California, which is mostly in like late August and early September, I'm watering the plants 3 times a week. Full overhead water with a hose. Lots and lots and lots of water. Okay, you can't overwater while you're watering. The paths like a lot of water. I heard another, the first place I ever rented greenhouse space is this guy who grew plants in Santa Cruz. And he told me this, he said, if you have a Cattleya and it's dry, water it tomorrow. If you have a Phalaenopsis and it's dry, water it today. If you have a path and it's dry, you should have watered it yesterday. That's a pretty good attitude. Yeah. The problem with paths is that a lot of the time, you'll grow them and they'll get dry, and then they'll start to wilt. So you'll look at the plant and you'll be like, oh, it's wilted, so I need to water it more. Well, by the time it wilts, that means it's lost all of its roots. So that's a big problem. Interestingly, paths grow roots pretty quickly. So if you have one of those plants that's wilted and you take it out of its pot, you repot it, finer mix in a smaller pot, and go back to watering it a lot, it'll perk right back up. So these are real tricks to being able to grow the plants well. The other major thing about PAFs, and really all orchids that I'll tell you, and you guys are kind of in a good position to hear this, is that water quality is incredibly important. In Southern California, we get water out of an agricultural well, and it comes up out of the ground at about 1,200 parts per million total dissolved solids. It's not clear. It's like white when you look through the water. It's like chalk. So all that water runs through a commercial reverse osmosis system. A little bit of the original well water is injected back in for trace elements. The water comes out of the tap that I'm fertilizing or watering with at about 80 parts per million total dissolved solids, which I think is higher than here. I think your water is better than that, which is awesome. So starting out with really good quality water is super important when you're growing all kinds of orchids, not just apples. Some things are incredibly sensitive to it. Things like Miltoniopsis, which I see you have people growing really well, that's a good sign. Probably means that water quality is good. Okay, other questions about growing or complexes or anything else? Yes?
Do you ever put sphagnum moss
No.
a little bit?
No, my mix is just bark and perlite. That's it.
Do they like to be tight in the pot or
Yeah, in a pretty small pot. Yep.
tight stuff in there?
How about fertilizer?
We fertilize. So fertilizer in orchids is another thing that's really interesting to think about. We fertilize with Balance 20-20-20. It comes in a 50-pound bag. You buy it at an agricultural supply store. No like little jars. The little jars are some entrepreneurial individual who's taken a 50-pound bag and put a little bit of it in a big jar. So that's one of the best reasons to be in an orchid society, is so your society should go and buy a 50-pound bag, and then everybody can take a scoop.
Calcium, you sprinkle with calcium?
I don't sprinkle with calcium. I just use a Balance 20-20-20 fertilizer. It applied with about 100 parts per million every single time I water.
And what is that in teaspoons to go?
It's about half string every time I water. So like half a teaspoon per gallon.
Every time.
Every single time. Yeah, so I don't change it. We don't like use a different fertilizer. There's no such thing as a bloom booster or anything like that. It's not a thing. The fertilizer that we use has a small amount of calcium and magnesium in the fertilizer, and that's the only calcium supplementation I'm doing with Paxil. So I think that like I'm pretty happy with how my plants are growing. There are probably much better growers with Paxil than me, but what I'm trying to do is have a 4,000 square foot greenhouse where I'm treating everybody more or less the same. I don't want to have a lot of mixes. I don't want to have a mixed components. So keeping it simple, making sure everything's in the same mix, making sure everything's consistent. Those are pretty important for production.
You change size of bark based on plant size?
Yeah, so these little pots are little plants are little tiny bark. So like a number 1 bark, really very small bark. So if we look at some of these things, you'll see the little bark chunks are tiny little bark chunks, really interesting. And then as they go into 4s, slightly larger bark, and then eventually like multiflorals and 6s and stuff will be the bigger size. The bark is revolutionary. It's those of you who have been growing orchids for a while and used to grow in Douglas fir bark, you heard the adage that you have to repot and pass every year, and that's what makes them happen. Well, my complex has been in the same pots for like 6 or 7 years. Let me tell you what, a plant that hasn't been touched in 7 years is really happy. So this modern bark that we have doesn't really break down very much over time. That's an unbelievably wonderful thing for orchid growing, because it means that you have to repot less often. That's great. So most of the time I'm repotting my plants when they've literally outgrown the pot that they're in. They're too big for the pot. It's exciting. Yes?
How do you pollinate?
That's a great question. I wish I had one in bloom to show you. Orchids have really interesting pollination biology. If we look at some of these plants over here, they all have like really specialized structure that houses the pollen. So thank you to whoever brought this beautiful Miltonia. This is my next thing that I'm working on, is miniaturizing Miltonias, making them warmer growing.
That was really nice.
The pollens are in this thing in the center of the flower called a column. And the pollens are always at the very tip of the column, and they have sort of like a thing that sits over top of them, which is what one of the stamens of the orchid turns into. It turns into a little cap that sits on top of the pollens. If you take that pollen cap off, you'll see two little tiny things that look like little globs of earwax, really is the best description of them. They're the same color. And you can pick them off with a toothpick or a forceps, and then there's a spot that's just sort of farther towards the center of the flower that you put those pollens into. And that's how you do like orchid pollination. Paphs are a little bit different because they have a pouch. The pouch in a slipper orchid is a pollination trap. So the idea is that an insect is sort of mesmerized by the staminode, hits the staminode in the middle. You can look at the staminode, so you know what I'm talking about here. This thing is a staminode right here. So in a lot of paths, the staminode is really interestingly colored. It tends to not be the case so much in complex paths because that tendency has really been bred out of them in a lot of cases. Let's see if we can find a good staminode to look at. So here's one. So this is close to a brachy, so it still has a staminode with some stuff on it. So like that little green mark there, and that big shield-shaped structure is a staminode. And the idea is that an insect looks at that unbelievably mesmerizing marking in the middle of that, slaps into it, falls down into the pouch. The front side of the pouch is smooth. The back side of the pouch has a little ladder of hairs. So the insect climbs out that little ladder of hairs and emerges right in here, right behind the staminode. And here on the side of the staminode, where the insect would emerge, is the little piece of pollen. So as it squeezes its way out that little hole, the pollen gets deposited on its back, and then it repeats, hits the staminode, falls down into the pouch, climbs out the back. Before it gets to the little area where it can exit from the flower is the stigmatic surface, and it wipes the pollen on the stigmatic surface, and then you pollinate the flower. When I make pollinations, I remove the pouch, I take the pollen, and I put it on the staminode, and then I wait for about a year. Pick the seed pod, send it to the lab, wait for hopefully a year, but sometimes more. Get the seedlings back, raise them take them out of a flask and raise them in a compost for a year. Put them into 2-inch pots, raise them for a year or two. Put them into 4-inch pots, raise them for a year or two, and then the leadership bloom. Now that's awful. It's awful. And so what Fred has said, and I really agree with this, and it's done a really good job for him breeding mini cats, is that what we're looking for are the best of the fastest. And it's not the best, it's the fastest that are the most important plants. Because by decreasing generation time, we can do all the things we need to do in terms of improvement way better than if we just breed with the best flower. So when I make a Grex, I'm usually keeping 2 plants from the Grex. That's it. And it's the fastest 2 plants. And so if they're good, awesome, I'll breed with them. If they're not good, oh well, make a new Grex. Now that sounds very mercenary. It's done a really good job, especially with Dellenati eyes. So Fred has done that with Dellenati eyes in our collection for like 5 generations now. And so I've now done that for 2 generations. Last year I got an FCC and 4 AMs on my Dellenati eye Grex, and they all bloomed 18 months out of the bottom. To me, that's success. So now we need to repeat that with other species and complexes and stuff like that. Yes?
So the magic eye,
The staminode, yeah.
is it, when you look at it under ultraviolet light, I mean, is there something?
Yeah, ultraviolet, yes, it's definitely
That's what's
ultraviolet.
drawing it
It's waxy, it's often 3-dimensional with like little bumps and stuff on it that are mimics of eggs and things like that. Real good like pollination biology for orchids and really for paphs, and then really for all orchids is very poorly done. Very poorly done. There's some evidence that some paphs are pollinated by egg parasitic flies. So they're pollinated by flies that lay their eggs in the eggs of other insect species. And so all these little like spots and warts and dots all over things are supposed to mimic insect eggs that a fly would be interested in laying its egg inside of. Syrphid moths. But that pollination biology has been done for a species out of 78 species of paphs. So who knows? This thing is made for me to mow. It's doing a great job. Yes.
You talked about watering cats a lot.
Mhm.
You overwater one of them?
Do I overwater them?
No.
Can you overwater a pet? Yes, definitely. Yep, definitely. The idea with most orchids is that they're sort of a wet, dry cycling of the plants.
Right.
If I were to water the plants like multiple times a week in the wintertime, they would stay too wet and the roots would rot. Absolutely. So you can overwater them just like you can overwater any orchid. So there's a balance there to learn for sure. But unlike a lot of other orchids, the balance, I would say you should err towards more water than less.
How do you know you're overwatering a cat without checking it out?
They start looking lousy, and then when you take them out of their pot, they have their roots. I would say, a lot of people are very shy to repot. I repot like 100 plants a week, and that takes maybe 45 minutes, and I can look at every single plant. Really get a good sense of whether it's looking good, whether it's growing well. To me, it's very exciting to pull the plant out of a pot and see like lots of good things it's doing. It's really awesome. Yes.
So you were saying that the advances in the bark is what's really helped you.
Mhm.
I mean, are you talking about orchiata or kiwi bark? What bark are you talking about?
Okay, so we use kiwi bark, but kiwi bark and orchiata both come from red pine trees. So they're like Australian forest product derivative thing. We grow Douglas firs here, and so for a long time we used Douglas fir bark as the orchid potting we did. Douglas fir bark's quite soft; it breaks down pretty quickly. In Australia, their big plantations and their houses and stuff are all built out of red pine, which is native to here. And we use the bark of it to pot orchids, and that bark is much harder and lasts a lot longer. It's a little hard to get it wet in the first place, but it really does a great job. Kiwi bark doesn't have lime added to it. Orchiata does have lime added to it, so I've found that you have to kind of monitor the pH in orchiata a little more closely and then add additional lime.
Kiwi has a higher calcium concentrated, doesn't it?
And Fred's like the national distributor of kiwi bark, and so we have tons of it in nursery, so that's what I use. When I first started, I was like, Fred, can we please get some lava rock? Because I was growing in a mix that was bark and perlite and lava rock. I really liked that. He was like, no.
Okay.
Yeah.
I assume that when you're watering a glass, it's not sitting in water.
No.
It falls through,
Yes.
right?
Yeah, and really, like, that's a thing to think about too, right? So, like, look at the bottom of the pot. That's not going to hold a lot of water. Don't be afraid to repot your plants. Don't be afraid to put your plants in your own mix that works for you. Don't be afraid to put your plants in your own like pot that you like and you want to grow. Don't be afraid to do that stuff. That's what makes you advance as a grower. Yes. Are they what?
The modern variety that we have on their own at some point.
Oh, okay. Good question. Sorry, I didn't hear you. I don't know the answer to that. No one knows the answer to that. It's a mess. There's not, unlike a lot of other kinds of orchids where, for whatever reason, ploidy was managed better with PAFs, largely because of Christopher Grand-Duke Nicholas, all the first generation of plants that were made with that plant were all like triplet, recessive chromosomes. And then some of them bred by unreduced triploid breeding or weird other combinations of things or low seed count or who knows. And so since then, germination is really a problem. Very commonly, I'll make calf crosses and send pods to the lab, and instead of getting back 8 or 10 flasks, which is what I really want, I'll get back 1. It's really hard to have a nursery with low production. And so One of the real tricks with breeding complex paths well is to know what plants produce a lot of seed and lean heavily on those. And that just comes from research. Lots of research. Sometimes those plants are pretty easy to get, like Arnie Clem has, he's in Chicago, so you probably know Arnie. He has a plant that just produces gobs and gobs of seed called New Light. So I have that, use it all the time. Machan has 3 plants that he really leans on hard to like produce lots and lots of seed. And I've got one of them, and I don't want to admit how expensive it was. I'll have to get the other 2 eventually because they're great, great breed. Ellis is really good. So finding those, using those, that's really the job. Yes.
Can regular pine bark be used?
Can regular pine bark. So these are in pine bark. I don't know, like whether using white pine bark versus red pine bark is anything different. I don't know. I mean, trial and error that's worked. It's really interesting to read some accounts of what paths used to be grown in. You know, like ground up leaves and sand mixed together in your driveway was one of the ways. In like fern rhizomes used to be a really common way to do it. I read accounts, so the sort of paths in Japan, complex path breeding in Japan was started by a guy named Mutu Kimura. And Kimura grew in a greenhouse that was sunken into the ground, so that only the roof was at ground level. So they would walk down into the greenhouse. And he potted all his plants in cut up Cryptomeria cones. Cryptomeria is a Japanese cedar tree. So that was what was available to him, so that's what he used. So you can grow in basically anything as long as you can adjust your watering to match. Experiment. So I have a friend on the eastern shore of Maryland who owns a pretty big acreage, and he has a huge number of holly trees. So he's chipped up holly trees and he's trying to grow orchids in that. He just started, 2 or 3 years from now, it'll be interesting to see how he does. But experimentation is super fun. Cool, I'm happy to take other questions individually. Thank you guys very much.
Thank you.